This is United States History 201, Presentation 17, The Age of Jackson, Part 2, Tyler Polk and the War with Mexico. So we're going to pick up where we left off in the last presentation, which was the death of William Henry Harrison 1 month after taking office, and start with the presidency of John Tyler. So John Tyler, of course, was the vice president elected in 1840. Now, this was an interesting situation because, remember, the Whigs were a fairly new party. They had come around in 1834 and been put together in 1834. In 1836, they didn't really have a candidate that suited their needs, and so in 1840 they solidify around William Henry Harrison, who was a candidate in 1836 as well. But the strongest support for Whigs came from the Northeast. But there was a faction of Whigs who were states' rights advocates, people that had opposed Andrew Jackson's actions in South Carolina in advocating the Force Bill. And so remember, South Carolina actually voted against Jackson in 32, against Jackson in 36. And this faction actually was important to the Whig Party because this group was located primarily in the South. So when they put together their ticket in 1840, they selected John Tyler because he was one of these states' rights, old states' rights Democrats, one of these Jeffersonians who they thought would help sway votes and win votes, and so they could win the 1840 election. And they were right. John Tyler helped do that. But he was not a Whig who believed in the American system. He didn't believe in the Whig platform. He believed in true Whiggery, which was you have a limited executive, a limited central government, and he believed in the Constitution and the strict interpretation of the Constitution. So when William Henry Harrison dies, John Tyler becomes president. Now, this is the first time this had ever happened. William Henry Harrison was the first president to die in office. So no one knew exactly what was going to happen. The Constitution says the vice president assumes the office of president, responsibilities of president, I should say, if the president is unable to do that job. But it doesn't say anything about how long that should be, or if there should be another election, or anything in that nature. So the Whigs believed that John Tyler, they actually called him his accidency, that John Tyler was going to simply be there for a certain amount of time, or that he would just kind of ceremonially carry out the functions of president, but that the real power should have been in the cabinet or perhaps in the Congress. But Tyler doesn't think that way. Tyler believes that he is president, and he's going to do exactly what the president should do. So Tyler's views of the executive branch are more in line with, say, George Washington. He was going to veto unconstitutional legislation. They were more in line with Thomas Jefferson when it came to foreign policy and domestic policy. So he is going to block essentially everything that the Whigs try to do through the Congress and the cabinet. In fact, there's a cabinet meeting. Tyler comes in and they have a cabinet meeting, and the cabinet members just say, "Look, John, we're going to run the government. You just rubber stamp everything." He said, "No. Either you're going to support what I do or you can resign." So all of these guys ultimately ended up resigning. So John Tyler opposed the Whig program. He opposed federally funded internal improvements. He opposed a protective tariff. He twice vetoed the reincorporation of a central banking system. So again, he was a Whig in the truest sense. He opposed Andrew Jackson, the king, because Jackson was arrogating power to the executive branch while concurrently weakening state power in the federal compact. The American system of Henry Clay did the same thing, he thought, and thus to Tyler and many Southern Whigs, Jackson and Clay were two shades of the same color. They both believed in unconstitutional legislation. They both believed in centralization. They both believed in nationalism, which Tyler didn't necessarily subscribe to. So Henry Clay and the National Republicans, or Whigs eventually, of course, advocated the Hamiltonian system. And when Tyler kept vetoing the legislation, they actually call a meeting, and they meet and they expel him from the party. They say, "You're no longer a Whig, you're out." And then most of Tyler's cabinet resigns, and they start referring to Tyler, as I said, as his accidency. Now, Tyler accepts the resignations and reorganizes his cabinet by appointing many of his Southern friends, including eventually John C. Calhoun and Abel P. Upshur, to cabinet positions. This was really the states' rights faction of the Whig Party. Now, Calhoun was never a Whig. He was loosely associated with the group at the beginning, but he was always a Democrat. Upshur was more along the same lines. Tyler actually became a Whig. But these other guys, not necessarily, but they leaned at least towards supporting elements of Whiggery at the beginning. So there's Upshur. Upshur was perhaps the leading constitutional scholar among the Southern states' rights Whig faction. In fact, at one point he directly refuted Joseph Story's version of the Constitution in his A Brief Inquiry into the True Nature of Our Federal Constitution. He supported the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions of 1798. He supported nullification. He supported secession. He really was a states' rights advocate. Now, what happens to Upshur is he's Secretary of Navy and Secretary of State, but he's killed in 1844 in an accident, an explosion, and then Tyler will appoint John C. Calhoun as Secretary of State. But this is a tragic occurrence, particularly for this intellectual school of thought, or this strain of thought, I should say, that's very much important to the Southern tradition, which is this limited central authority. He was very good at this, and when he dies, that they lose a champion in that. Now, one of the defining issues of the Tyler administration is Texas. It had been a goal of many Americans to annex Texas for years, and Americans had a vested interest in Texas beginning in the 1820s. By the mid-1840s, Texas had been a sovereign state, such as the state of Great Britain, for almost a decade, because it had declared its independence from Mexico. And by the time it was annexed to the United States, it had been an independent country, a sovereign state, for years. Texas was once part of both Spain and later Mexico, after Mexico gained its independence from Spain in 1821. And Americans were actually invited into Texas by Spain beginning in 1821. But the situation was made delicate by Mexican independence, because the Mexican government wasn't as receptive to these American settlers as the Spanish government was. So thus began a long-strained relationship between Mexican leaders and American settlers. Now, the father of Texas, the man who's called the father of Texas, is Stephen F. Austin. It was his father, Moses Austin, who was given the original claims to land in Texas, but he died, and so then Stephen F. Austin brought in the first 300 families to Texas in the 1820s. And so Stephen F. Austin was the driving force in the settlement of Texas. These 300 families, a lot of them are still around in Texas, and they still have a tremendous amount of political and economic clout in the state. And that's because they were there at the beginning. Now, in 1836, Texas is going to declare its independence from Mexico. And then it will fight a war with Mexico over independence. So there are reasons for this. So the Texans essentially dusted off the Declaration of Independence. They had problems with Mexican authority or Mexican law in many different areas. Many historians point to slavery as the defining issue, and Mexico was hostile to slavery, but there were other issues too. The Mexican government was trying to confiscate firearms. There were problems with centralization. The Mexican government wouldn't recognize Texan land claims. So there were all kinds of things working here. It wasn't just that issue of slavery, which everyone focuses on. There were other things happening. So the president of Mexico, or general or dictator of Mexico, was Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. He led the Mexican forces against Texas in 1836. That's what he looked like. And the American forces were led by Sam Houston. He was a general, a president of Texas, the second president of Texas, in fact, the United States senator from Texas, really the hero of the Texas War for Independence, a member of the Army during the War of 1812 in the United States, and he led Texan forces away from the Alamo in 1836. So we'll talk about the Alamo in a second, but the Alamo was a defensive position on really the frontier of Texas. No one thought that the Mexican army was going to attack there. Well, they end up doing that. So this is why Sam Houston wasn't there. So the Alamo was just simply an old Spanish mission that later became famous as a stronghold for Texan forces during the 1836 Battle of the Alamo. There wasn't much to it. In fact, it had kind of been run down over time. There's a little town around the Alamo, and so this wasn't like it was a fort. I mean, there was a fort there, but the Alamo just became the location of several battles back and forth over time in Texas. Now, there were some important individuals at the Alamo at the time. For example, James Bowie, who is the hero of the Battle of the Alamo, co-commander of the fort, and he had legendary fame, particularly for the Bowie knife. But he was the man in charge of the militia at the fort. And then you had William Barrett Travis from Claiborne, Alabama. He was the leader of the regular troops at the fort in 1836. And when the situation looked dire, it appeared that the Mexican army shows up. They have around 4,000 men, and the Texan army has nothing, really. I mean, 100 men or so. Travis will call a meeting, and he'll draw a line in the sand. He'll say, anybody wants to cross this line now, you're free to go. We won't hold you here, but if you stay here, you know the consequences. And that essentially was, we're all going to die at the Alamo, because once they attack, we won't be able to hold them off. And so this is the famous line in the sand, and only one person crossed the line and left. The reason we know about this speech is because that one person, he later wrote about it. And then Travis is going to write a letter to try to gain some reinforcements. And this is what he said. I am besieged by 1,000 or more of the Mexicans under Santa Anna. I have sustained a continual bombardment and cannonade for 24 hours and have not lost a man. The enemy has demanded to surrender at discretion. Otherwise, the garrison are to be put to the sword if the fort is taken. What that means, surrender at discretion, that only the leaders of the fort will be killed, and everyone else will be saved. And this is why he said, if you want to leave now, you can. I have answered the demand with a cannon shot, and our flag still waves proudly from the walls. I shall never surrender or retreat. Then I call on you in the name of liberty, of patriotism, and everything dear to the American character, to come to our aid with all dispatch. The enemy is receiving reinforcements daily and will no doubt increase to 3,000 or 4,000 in 4 or 5 days. If this call is neglected, I am determined to sustain myself as long as possible and die like a soldier who never forgets what is due to his own honor and that of his country. Victory or death. William Barrett Travis. So this is a very manly position to take, and he calls this the American character, liberty and patriotism, and resistance to tyranny. And so for a long time that was seen as the American character. Now, of course, one of the other famous individuals there was David Crockett, the king of the wild frontier later on, but a folk hero, frontiersman, member of the United States Congress, and he would be killed at the Alamo. In fact, the rumor is the last man killed at the Alamo. But this is what David Crockett really looked like. So the Battle of the Alamo takes place between February 23rd and March 6, 1836. The old Spanish mission would be besieged by the Mexican army in an attempt to root out the Texan occupiers. The Mexican army was led by Santa Anna, and they outnumbered the Texas garrison by almost 10 to 1, 2,400 to around 200. And there's speculation there were more, maybe 4,000 men. It's unknown. All the Texan participants in the battle will be killed, including Bowie and Crockett, or Bowie and Crockett, I should say, and there would also be around 600 Mexican casualties. And so, because of this, the battle cry for the Texas War of Independence becomes, remember the Alamo. Well, from this point, Santa Anna will march east and try to chase Sam Houston around, and this will culminate at the Battle of San Jacinto in April of 1836. It only took 18 minutes to defeat Santa Anna's forces, because what happens is that Sam Houston forces Santa Anna to split his army, and then he picks the place to fight, and when he finally determines to fight, Santa Anna is unprepared. Now, there's a rumor that Santa Anna was occupied at the time with the Yellow Rose of Texas. This is perhaps the most beautiful woman in all of Texas, and she had gone to, I'm sure, discuss battle plans in Santa Anna's tent, and when the battle happens, he's not prepared to fight. And so this is a rout. And because of it, Texas wins independence and maintains that independence from 1836 to 1845. Now, there were calls for annexation in the United States, but these were rejected by many Northerners who fear the addition of many new slave states. Remember, this is going to upset the balance of power in the Senate, which was the real issue behind slavery, the slavery question in the mid-19th century. The balance of power in the Senate, political economy. So when Tyler becomes president, he wants Texas annexed, and in fact, he's going to achieve the annexation of Texas in 1845 through a joint resolution of Congress. And basically what happens is, after the 1844 election, which I'll talk about in a minute, Tyler recognizes that Texas is going to come to the Union anyway, so he really starts pushing it. Now, some people have said this was unconstitutional, that you had to do some other means to annex Texas, but if the Congress resolves to annex a state, remember, well, that is control over the territories or the western lands has always been the purview of Congress. Then they can add a state this way. So Texas wants to join the Union, and it joins the Union through a joint resolution of Congress. Congress agrees. All right, so let's talk about the 1844 election. The Whigs will nominate Henry Clay, and they think this is their chance because John Tyler's not going to run again. The Whigs nor the Democrats will support him. And there isn't really a front runner for the Democrats. There wasn't anyone that just stood out like an Andrew Jackson. So Clay thinks this is my opportunity. I'm going to win here, and I've waited a long time, and I'm going to finally get the presidency. Well, as in 1824, Clay will actually attempt to cut a deal with the presumed candidate for the Democrats, Martin Van Buren. So he believed the Democrats would just renominate Van Buren, and Van Buren would then be the candidate again. And what the idea was that if Van Buren was nominated, that Clay and Van Buren would not discuss foreign policy during the campaign, only domestic policy. Well, that would play into Clay's hands. But Van Buren is not nominated by the Democrats, therefore this deal falls apart, and the Democrats nominate James K. Polk of Tennessee. Polk was known as Young Hickory. He was Andrew Jackson's protege. Served in the House of Representatives when Jackson was president. And during the campaign, he makes the annexation of Texas a major campaign issue. This is why when Tyler gets it in 1845, it was going to be a done deal once Polk became president. He also uses a campaign slogan, 54-40 or fight. All of Oregon, 54-40 or fight. In other words, we're going to take the Oregon Territory, and I'll talk about that, what that means in a minute. He advocated tariff reduction, an independent treasury, and he was a proponent of what was called manifest destiny. His real objective, though, in all of this was California and the Pacific. Polk wanted Pacific ports. He wanted California. So here's the 1844 election. You see very close in the popular vote, but Polk wins fairly handily in the Electoral College. So Polk almost rushes into two concurrent wars. The first is with Great Britain in Oregon. Great Britain and the United States jointly control Oregon, and for years there have been discussion of settling this issue at the 49th parallel. But when Polk comes in office, he starts antagonizing Great Britain and basically tells them, I'm not going to negotiate with you. And so Great Britain refuses to even talk to Polk. Well, this almost leads to war, because this Cold War almost turns hot when the British get a little fed up with James K. Polk. But Polk really wants California. Oregon will be fine, and eventually the United States is going to acquire Oregon, half of the Oregon Territory. The British will get the northern half, which includes Vancouver Island, and the United States will get the southern half, which is where most American settlers were anyways. And they're going to settle at the 49th parallel. But the British were thinking about going to war with the United States. It's a good thing they didn't, because Polk wants California, and when a secret mission to purchase territory from Mexico fails, when Mexico refuses to budge, he devises another plan, which is war. So the Mexican War lasts from 1846 to 1848, is the first instance of executive deception with the intent of goading the United States into a war. Polk, in fact, would send Zachary Taylor into the disputed zone between Texas and Mexico. The United States is saying that the Rio Grande River is the border between Mexico and the United States, and the Mexicans are saying, no, it's the River Nueces. But Polk will send Taylor into that territory between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande, so they'll be attacked by the Mexican army. Polk will then respond with a request for a declaration of war, saying that blood has been shed on American soil. Congress will declare war on Mexico within the week. Now, there was tremendous opposition to this war. The Whigs generally opposed the war, though the two most popular generals, Winfield Scott and Zachary Taylor, were both Whigs, and they called it Mr. Polk's War. Abolitionists feared the addition of several slave states into the Union. They called this the slave power. We'll talk about this more as we move into the next material. And someone like Joshua Giddings, who was a Northerner, said the war was unholy and unjust. So you had some opposition from the North, and definitely from abolitionists, who didn't like the idea of a war that we might acquire slave territory. But if this was accurate, then the most ardent, or the spokesman for slavery in the South, should have supported the war, but he didn't. And that was John C. Calhoun. John C. Calhoun opposed the war, and he's the Southern defender of slavery. So that's an interesting argument when the strongest defender of slavery opposes it, at least at the time. And he said this, Calhoun said this, I saw from the circumstances under which the war was made a total departure from the course of policy which had governed the country from the commencement of our government until that time. And this too under circumstances calculated to lead to most disastrous consequences. So Polk was against it because of the destruction of the Constitution in the executive branch. There were people who wanted to take all of Mexico, the entire country, and make it part of the United States. And there were some important battles here. For example, Winfield Scott made the largest amphibious assault in the history of warfare to that point at Veracruz. And eventually the United States would take the capital of Mexico. And so the result was the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which ended the Mexican War. The United States would acquire the Mexican cession for $15 million, which I'll show you in a minute, which included California and the disputed area between Texas and Mexico. The United States would also agree to assume Texan claims against the Mexican government for about $3.5 million. So we're going to end up paying about $18.5 million for all of this territory, which I'll show you in a second. There were also 13,000 American deaths in the war. 90% of those were from disease, though, not from combat deaths. So this is the Mexican cession. This large chunk of land, you get California, you get, not this part, this is called the Gadsden Purchase, we'll get into that later, but you get all of this stuff. It's a very large purchase for $18.5 million.